Hey everybody, this is Matthew Saville with SLRlounge.com and another episode of How We Shot It. Actually, today we're going to combine our previous photo of the day posts with our usual regular How We Shot It posts. And in the future, from now on, we're just going to call it How We Shot It. And that was the original intention of my photo of the day posts. It was just to show you guys a random image and kind of explain how it was shot and how it was processed a little bit. You know, just the kind of the thought process behind it. And so from now on, pretty much Monday through Friday, every weekday, we're going to do a How We Shot It post. And all right, let's get started. Today we're going to talk about motion blur in broad daylight. As you can see here, this was a mid-afternoon or midday photo. You know, the sun is shining and everything, but look at the shutter speed for this image. Down here in the metadata, you can see I am at 2 seconds. And much more obviously, the train is blurring through this photo. Now, this train isn't going a million miles an hour, it's just barely pulling out of the station. So a 2-second shutter speed is what created this blur from right about here to right about here. If you look at this other image, you can see the train's moving all the way through. Here's another one, and here's one where I was just getting started and kind of prepping my shot, and you can see the train is holding still because this is the San Juan Capistrano train station right here. So anyways, this is my favorite image from this session, and the question is, how on earth did I get to a 2-second shutter speed in broad daylight? Now, many of you probably know the Sunny 16 rule, which I'm at f13 here. You can see my aperture. f13 is close enough that we can just pretend we're following the Sunny 16 rule. And the Sunny 16 rule states that if I am at f16, then my ISO should match my shutter speed. And so if I'm at ISO 100, my shutter speed in this situation should have been roughly 1/100th of a second. But instead, I'm at 2 seconds, which is how many stops different? I guess, you know what? I'm going to count on my fingers. You guys can count along too if you want. And let's just start at what we know should have been a proper exposure, 1/100th of a second. And let's count down to 2 seconds. So I'm going to go from 100th, I'm going to go to 50th of a second, 25th of a second, 12th or 15th of a second, 1/8 of a second, 1/4 of a second, 1/2 a second, 1 whole second, and 2 whole seconds. Almost lost count there, actually. So what do we got? 5, 6, 7, 8 stops. Roughly 8 stops of difference between broad daylight and this proper exposure, which you can see, even though there is a bright white subject here in the photo, it's still not really blown out. So how did I accomplish this? Well, the trick is what is called a neutral density filter, or an ND filter for short. And basically, an ND filter is just a filter that darkens the entire image overall, from edge to edge. It's usually a circular filter, but you can buy square filters for the holders and whatnot. And so what I was doing in this situation was I probably also used a circular polarizer, because you can see the sky here is really dark blue. And an ND filter would affect the image evenly overall. It wouldn't just affect the sky or anything in particular. It would affect the entire image. So because this sky up here is so deep dark blue, I probably also had a polarizer, and a polarizer does darken the sky a little bit more than everything else, but it does darken the entire image by about 1.5 stops. So let's say the entire image is darkened about 1.5 stops or 2 stops by the circular polarizer, and then on top of that, or underneath that, depending on what order I put the filters on my lens, there is also an ND filter. And that ND filter is probably in the range of about 6 stops. That's a common ND filter increment. A 6-stop neutral density filter plus a 1.5 or a 2-stop circular polarizer would give me the overall darkening effect that would cause my shutter speed to be 2 seconds and properly exposed. And as you can see, if you look at these other images, you can see I was playing around with the exposure a little bit as well. I tried f11 at 1 second and ISO 200. Maybe this was before or after I put on the circular polarizer on top of the ND filter. But basically what I was doing was I was kind of getting set up and waiting for the train to pull out of this station, and so I was trying ISO 200, and on this particular camera, this was made on a Nikon D300, ISO 200 is the lowest native ISO. So if I went to ISO 100, like for this shot and this shot, then that meant that I really had to be careful of my highlights, because ISO 100 on the D300 is just ISO 200 but darkened in camera, which means that if I had blown out the highlights at ISO 200, they would still be blown out at ISO 100, even though it was technically one stop darker. So that's just a side note for you all. If you're trying to get a really slow shutter speed in bright daylight, don't just bump your ISO down to 50 or 100, because doing so, if it's not your native ISO, will not save you any highlight data. And that is why you're better off just using an ND filter or a polarizing filter on your lens to darken the overall image and give you that slow shutter speed. So anyways, everybody, that's about it for my tips with how to shoot this type of situation in broad daylight. And keep in mind that, especially if you're stacking filters, you do need to be very careful of your corners. As you can tell, almost all of my corners are already black, but you can look at this corner here and tell that there is no vignetting, and that is something that you always have to be careful for if you're stacking filters. Some lenses will give you vignetting, especially if you're using thicker filters, and some lenses, if you're lucky, you can use some of those slim filters and get away with stacking one or two filters without getting your corner vignetted. So some people will recommend against stacking filters, but I say go for it as long as you check your overall sharpness and you know that you're not getting any degradation in your fine detail. Of course, that's usually a factor of how good quality your filters are. So if you have really cheap filters, maybe don't do stacking. But anyways, there you go. Those are my thoughts on the subject. Let's open this image really quick in Camera Raw. I'm just going to double click on it. And let's talk about how we would edit this particular image. I'm going to zero it out just by clicking on the little menu and doing Camera Raw defaults so we can see what it looked like. As you can tell, this highlight here is just barely blown, so I do want to preserve it. But instead of going straight to these sliders, I want to start with a preset from the SLR Lounge preset system. I just want to click on one of these presets from the Vivid Landscape mixology. I'm going to start with Standard Color. Let's see what the HDR presets do. Maybe HDR Light, HDR Strong, HDR Max. This is definitely a little bit over the top. I do want these dark, moody shadows here. Sometimes you want dark, moody shadows, sometimes you don't. And in this case, I want to go with just the Vivid Landscape Standard or maybe the HDR Light. And that definitely looks good, so I'm going to leave that. Let's go back to the Basic tab here and do some fine tuning. As you can see, this is still almost blown out, and this is still a little bit bright. So I'm going to click on my exposure and just hit my down arrow, go down just a little bit more, maybe a third of a stop. I'm also going to drag my highlights and whites all the way down, because remember I was saying you got to be really careful with your ISO in that ISO low setting. You can run into trouble really quick. So I want to check this and zoom all the way into 100%. I'm going to hit H to get my hand tool, just scroll around here a little bit. And you know what? If I look very closely, it looks like I just barely preserved some of the highlights or most of the highlights here. And I like it right there, just like that. So this looks good. Let's check our corners actually. I want to check some things. There's no specks of dust. There's no vignetting here. We already looked at that in the corners. But I am going to suspect this is one of those kit lenses or an upgraded kit lens. It's a 16 to 85 millimeter lens. That's a crop sensor lens. It's got very sharp corners, but it does have a little bit of chromatic aberration. So I'm just going to hop over here to the Lens Corrections tab, hit Remove Chromatic Aberration. And you can see those faint little colors there that were on those edges have disappeared. So anyways, while we're zoomed in, I want to look at my fine detail overall. And remember, I was stacking some filters, so that might have harmed my fine detail a tiny bit. And to compensate for that, I'm going to go to my Details tab here and just give myself a little bit of extra sharpening compared to what that Vivid Landscape preset usually gives me. What I'm going to do is I'm going to hold down Shift and just click my up arrow so that it goes in increments of 10 instead of increments of 1 if you don't hold down the Shift key like this. And maybe I like it right about there at 95. That looks great. It's got some good solid detail here. I'm going to right click, go back to Fit in View, and honestly that's about it. I love this image just the way it is overall. I do have one more issue back here in the Basic tab, and that is, as you'll notice, the tint is already dialed from the As Shot. It's already down at -14, and that is probably because the ND filter that I was using had a slight magenta cast to it. A lot of ND filters will do this. If I go back to 0, you can see this, the whole image is kind of pink magenta, and this used to be a huge issue with ND filters when you were shooting on film back in the day, but now with digital, all I need to do is go down, let's try -10, and let's try -20 maybe. That's a little bit too far. Where was I? -14? Maybe -18 or so works great. I like it right about here actually. Now I'm starting to see the natural sunlight colors. Alrighty, folks, that's about it for now. Thank you so much for tuning in to today's episode of How We Shot It, and until next time, take care.